dog barks at the coffin during funeral. When a man asks why, the priest gets nervous. It was a grey, overcast morning when the small community gathered at the old chapel on the hill. The air was thick with sorrow, and the only sounds were the whispers of condolences and the occasional rustling of leaves. A beloved member of the town, Mr. Harold Thompson, had passed away. Known for his generosity and kind heart, Harold's funeral drew nearly everyone who had ever known him. As the crowd filled the chapel, a small figure emerged from the mist. It was a scruffy brown dog, its fur matted and eyes filled with an odd mixture of sadness and intensity. No one knew exactly where the dog had come from, but Harold had been known to feed strays, so it wasn't surprising that one had shown up. The dog didn't sit quietly like the others. Instead, it paced back and forth at the back of the chapel, letting out low growls and short, sharp barks. At first, people assumed it was simply distressed by the somber atmosphere, but as the funeral service began and the priest started his eulogy, the dog's behavior became more erratic. The suspicious behavior when the coffin was brought in, the dog's barking intensified. Its sharp cries echoed through the chapel, sending shivers down the spines of everyone present. It wasn't just barking, it was as if the dog was trying to warn them of something. One man in the crowd, a young journalist named Peter, couldn't help but feel that there was something strange about the dog's behavior. He watched as the dog's growls turned into desperate whines every time it got close to the coffin. Peter leaned over to the person next to him and whispered, "Has anyone ever seen this dog before?" The elderly woman shook her head no, but Harold loved dogs. Maybe it's one he cared for. Peter wasn't convinced. Something about the dog's intensity felt off. It wasn't mourning, it was fear. The question that changed everything. As the service continued, the priest spoke about Harold's life, his contributions to the community, and his unwavering faith. But Peter noticed the priest's voice faltered every time the dog barked. His eyes would dart nervously toward the coffin, and his hands trembled as he flipped through his notes. Unable to contain his curiosity, Peter stood up mid-service. "Father," he called out, his voice cutting through the room. "Do you know why this dog is behaving this way?" All eyes turned to the priest, who froze for a moment. His face turned pale, and he clutched the podium tightly. I don't know," he stammered. The dog, as if responding to Peter's question, barked louder and began pawing at the base of the coffin. Gasps filled the room as people started murmuring among themselves. A dark truth unveiled. Peter stepped forward, his heart pounding. "Something isn't right here," he said firmly. "This dog knows something we don't." The priest tried to regain control of the situation. "This is a sacred place, please, sit down. The dog is simply confused," but before he could finish, the dog let out a long, mournful howl and began clawing at the coffin with frantic energy. Peter couldn't ignore it anymore. "Open the coffin," he demanded. The room fell silent. The priest's hands shook visibly now, and his eyes darted toward the coffin like a man hiding a terrible secret. "That's highly inappropriate," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. But the crowd had turned. Murmurs of agreement spread as others joined Peter's plea. The dog's behavior, the priest's nervousness, it was too much to ignore. Reluctantly, the funeral director stepped forward and began unsealing the coffin. The shocking discovery, as the lid was lifted, the room erupted in gasps and cries of horror. Inside the coffin lay not Harold Thompson, but an entirely different man, someone no one recognized. The body was hastily dressed in Harold's clothes, but it was clear this wasn't him. The dog barked furiously, standing protectively near the coffin as if to guard against further deception. The priest collapsed into a nearby chair, his face buried in his hands. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," he muttered, his voice filled with regret. Peter turned to him, his journalist instincts kicking in. "What do you mean? Where is Harold?" The priest looked up, tears streaming down his face. He died under suspicious circumstances. His body was taken before we could perform the rites. I was told to stay silent and use this decoy. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. The community rallies. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. Anger, confusion, and sorrow filled the air as the community realized they had been deceived. But the dog, Harold's loyal companion, it turned out, had refused to let the lie go unnoticed. Peter vowed to investigate what had happened to Harold, and the community rallied behind him. The dog became a symbol of loyalty and truth, its actions proving that even in the darkest moments, love and justice could prevail. The legacy of Harold Thompson. In the weeks that followed, Peter uncovered a web of corruption involving Harold's death. Justice was served, and Harold's body was finally laid to rest with the dignity he deserved. The dog, who had exposed the truth, was adopted by Peter and became a cherished member of his family. Every time it barked, Peter couldn't help but smile, reminded of the day a scruffy stray became a hero.